About 50 years ago, an astronaut returning from the moon experienced things that he could not find a scientific explanation for. So with some colleagues, he launched a new science focused on the mind and how it works in the body and across space and time. It's the field of noetics, where the tools of modern science are used to help us understand how what we think and feel affects us and the world around us. Now this is Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments from the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon.
Hello there. You've tuned into Noetic Moments, the show where we discover what different scientists say that consciousness is, what it does, how it works, and how our lives could be very different if we understood it better. I'm Ruth Miller, your host, and through this series of programs I'll be sharing some of the history, explaining some of the ideas and the experiments, and introducing some of the people whose work has defined this field of research. We'll also take your questions and explore some new items. Today is the first episode in this series, and today we're going to talk about what the show is about, what Noetics is, who Edgar Mitchell is, and the Institute of Noetic Sciences. We'll talk a little bit about René Descartes and what's called the Cartesian Split. Then I'm going to explore two ideas of consciousness that we have in today's modern thought. All right, so what is this show about? This is an exploration of what the mind is and what it does in our lives and in our worlds. Starting with Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung over weeks to come, we'll look at some of the early history of psychological and psychic research. And then, week by week, we'll move through the various models of mind and consciousness through the 1960s, and we'll explain a little about how they help us make sense of our experience. And then each week, I'm going to attempt to answer your questions, the ones that you send in to me at our website, which is www.noeticmoments.org. And then we'll review a book. And finally, most weeks, depending on how much time everything else is taking, I'm going to offer some activity that you can try in order to expand your own noetic experience. So let's start. Let's start with the foundation. Why is it that a whole new kind of science had to be created? Why is it that there is a whole new realm of ideas and thoughts that weren't even possible 100, 200 years ago? Way back at the turn of the Renaissance era, you may recall from your science classes that there were people like Galileo and Copernicus who had strange ideas at the time about how the world works and where our position in the solar system was and what those stars might be out there. And, well, they were being punished awfully for having those ideas and publishing their results. And the Inquisition was on their tails, and many, many people who were interested in describing the science of our world were afraid of being burned at the stake. By the 1600s, a priest named René Descartes offered a model that might possibly prevent some of his philosophically thinking friends from having those fears. He wrote a series of papers that begin with the very famous phrase, cogito ergo sum. Now, we're used to thinking of cogito as its derivative in English, cogitate, to think. But he was also saying, I am aware. I'm simply aware. I'm awake, and therefore I am. This document that he put together was his idea for the possibility that perhaps the realm of knowledge could be divided into two different realms. One dealing with the planet and the natural world and what bodies do and what they're like and things like that. And the other realm of knowledge being about the mind and the spirit and the soul. And what Descartes offered was suggesting that the church, which was the primary repository of knowledge at that time, be responsible for and in charge of and manage the knowledge that had to do with the mind and the soul and the spirit, and that all these other people who were beginning to be known as natural philosophers and scientists, that these people would be able to freely explore how it is that the world works and not mess with the spiritual or mental aspects of life. I think you see where I'm going. This split became known as the Cartesian Split. Physicists, chemists, biology, all these fields emerged over the next couple of hundred years and are continuing to emerge in the assumption that mind and spirit and soul have nothing to do with what they are studying. It also meant that the method that we call the scientific method could not be applied to mind and soul and spirit. Could not be applied. So the scientific method had to be assigned only to the physical and natural world, and the church was responsible for everything else. This became such a hard line that even Isaac Newton, who was only a few years after René Descartes, had to separate out. He literally recopied some of his findings to separate out all of his mystical ideas so that his hard scientist members of the Royal Society who wanted his results would be willing to accept his results. In particularly the last century, physicists began to be aware of a realm smaller than the atom. They began to have a problem because it turns out that whether a conscious being is present or not actually determines the outcome of some experiments, particularly the very famous double slit experiment, in which you have waves or particles, depending on how it is designed and how it is implemented. In any case, this split has frustrated chemists and physicists dealing with the quantum level, perhaps because it became obvious that the presence of certain physicists in the room when certain experiments were being conducted changed the outcome of the experiments even beyond the traditional presence or absence of a conscious being. So we're starting to get something that was overlapping and merging, once again, the mind and the natural world. Now, you may not be aware of it, but our culture actually has two ideas of what consciousness is. One is what the paramedics are looking for when they work with someone who's been in an accident or something. It's being awake, being aware of surroundings, knowing what's happening in space and time. We've all seen, if only on television, where they're asking what day of the week it is, what's your name, what's your address, who's president, all that sort of thing. That is the medical and psychological notion of consciousness. But there is a growing field, and this is what we're going to be talking about on this show, that is exploring the possibility that that's only one small part of what consciousness is, based on a lot of anecdotal evidence, which amounts to observations, and using the scientific method, the very scientific method that helped us discover the field of quantum mechanics or the biology of the body. That very scientific method can be applied to understanding the observations that have been made about how mind works and what it's capable of being and doing. And that process of applying the scientific method to understanding consciousness is what is being called noetics, the science of noetics. There is an Institute of Noetic Sciences, we'll talk more about that in a moment, and that institute calls consciousness, or their field of research, noetics, the intersection of science and profound human experience. Now, if you go to Wikipedia and you look up noetics, it'll tell you that it's the field of mental operations, processes, states, and products. And that's a very objective way of talking about it, and it's accurate as well. But ions at another level will also say that noetics is the science of what connects us. It's talking about science in a whole new application, still using the scientific method, but looking at something entirely new and different. So, these are some of the basic ideas about what noetics is, but others are even more expansive.
Isn't that what we all want to know? What is life? What is consciousness?
How is it that we're aware that we're aware? What remains if ego or self dissolves completely?
Consciousness is before everything an experience.
The big question is, how do you turn the waters of the brain into the wine of our conscious experience?
Meditation is the tried and true course for understanding the nature of mind, and psilocybin is the crash course.
It felt like the heartbeat of reality itself. The question is how much of reality you can take.
So that was the trailer for a movie called Aware that is being released here in the near future. And it's an exploration of all the different ways people may be conscious, the different states of consciousness, and what the role of that consciousness that the states they are entering into might be. Yes. So, this concept of what consciousness is and what noetics can be is actually a very new one. It was being used a little bit around the edges, but it became a working principle in American culture when one of the astronauts returned from the moon. His name is Edgar Mitchell, and he grew up on a West Texas farm with horse-drawn plows, and as a young Navy pilot, was one of the ones who observed the atomic testing out in the Marshall Islands, and he observed the mushroom clouds. Then he actually managed to escape our planet shortly before his 41st birthday. On that trip, he had some remarkable experiences, which I want to share with you now.
I'm Edgar Mitchell, Apollo 14 astronaut. I had an experience coming back from the moon that it caused me to start focusing myself on what is the nature of consciousness, because I had a very powerful experience while I was in space. Consciousness, which is what the quantum world is all about, and let me illustrate that with a very simple idea. Mom and Dad go out for dinner, leave Johnny home with the babysitter. Halfway through dinner, Mom jumps up, something's wrong with Johnny at home, calls home. Sure enough, he fell out of his high chair, bumped his head, and is screaming bloody murder. How did Mama know that? That's quantum entanglement, and I'll call it intuition, but we call our intuition our sixth sense, and it really should be called our first sense because it's more fundamental. It's been around forever, and it is a part of the fundamental properties of nature. So what I'm wanting to point out here, for 40 years I've been studying the properties of consciousness, and it goes throughout all of nature and matter, and it begins with the quantum property that when particles are in a process together and they go apart from each other, they maintain their correlation regardless of where they go. And that also has spawned non-locality, which means that this happens at faster than the speed of light. And so the speed of light is not a fundamental with regard to consciousness and the propagation of consciousness. So here we are in the 21st century, 500 years after Descartes, 400 years after Newton and Kepler, and we now realize that we should be describing our universe instead of just matter and energy, which comes out of Newtonian physics, but we must describe our universe as matter, energy, and awareness, which is the bottom of consciousness, as the properties of our universe. So we have added a major fundamental to the nature that we didn't really know until the 20th century.
Edgar Mitchell went on to form the Institute of Noetic Sciences after all of those understandings, and they've done a lot of marvelous research. Normally now, I would be talking about the books that might have come out of that research. But I'm not going to do that today. I'm going to do that another day. It occurred to me that I need to tell you something about me so you know who you're listening to, who's putting all of this together and telling you all this stuff. And if you want to look at some of it now, you can go to our website, noeticmoments.org. And if there's a book or a film you would like me to talk about on this show, you can email me, ruth@noeticmoments.org, and I'll take a look at it and see what I can do. And any other questions you have, too. So, to tell you about me, who is this person? Well, I've been interested in consciousness ever since I was very young. I grew up in a household of academics. I'm a fifth-generation college professor, can you believe it? And now my daughter is teaching graduate students. Amazing. Anyway, in our household, where both the arts and sciences were encouraged, I had a grandmother who had lived and studied in India for a number of years and had seen many apparently miraculous events. And so I got hooked. And it's not too surprising that when I got to college, I studied psychology and anthropology, trying to understand what it was that I had heard about growing up and what might be possible. Not only did I want to know what was going on in our culture and the way we were growing up, but I understood from my grandmother's experience and other people's that there were other ways of doing things in other cultures, hence the anthropology. After I graduated and was living as a Navy wife, I continued my studies, both formally and informally. I usually would take a class in whatever town we were living in, and we lived in a lot of towns. And I was always a member of the library, and I'd check out at least one book in psychology and one book on philosophy from the library just about every week. At the same time, I was doing work in community development wherever we were stationed. And one of those stations, I really was frustrated by the quality of the air and the water. So much dirt, so much death. I became really concerned. And I was working with the League of Women Voters, who were forming study centers around the environmental issues. I ended up going from there on to more graduate school and completed a program in environmental studies, during which time I realized that while we had a lot of evidence that human beings consistently destroy our environments, we have no idea why. Why do we do this? So that again sent me back into psychology and anthropology. About that time, I discovered a whole nother new field, the field of cybernetics, which is the science of how information, energy, and matter interact in all kinds of systems. So the decision-making in all the systems, goal-setting, decision-making, how is it that systems form and formulate the directions they are moving? And that includes not just computers and rockets and all those other cybernetic systems. It also includes us as individual human beings, and it includes cultures and communities and organizations. And so I earned another degree. And during that time, I began working with Willis Harman, Oliver Markley, Dwayne Elgin, and a bunch of others at Stanford Research Institute, which is now known as SRI International. And we did studies on how knowledge was being created and used in education, how our image of ourselves affects our future, what might be happening to the future of transportation and energy, and how organizations could set up systems to track trends and forecast possible futures. Well, in the process, we developed a number of intuitive methods that complemented those analytical tools that everyone was using, and that began to be the focus of my personal academic research. It actually was the core of my master's thesis and began to be part of what I was going on to do. At the time, I was offered a fellowship as a student in a doctoral program here in Oregon. I accepted that fellowship, and over the next several years, I contributed to a bunch more futuristic studies and wove in other things, including how do managers make decisions? What are the different things they bring to the decision-making process? And what kind of goals a global community might need, as well as things like, the energy technologies that are emerging in the Pacific Northwest. And through all of that, it became more and more clear that reports and briefings did not affect outcomes, but that changes in perspective, in mind frames, in consciousness were essential if there were going to be any real changes in how things were done individually and collectively. Well, about that time, I got really, really sick, and medical science had no solutions. So I went back to my studies of consciousness and mind-body interactions in this culture and other cultures. I began to look again at how emotions affect physical systems in the body. And beyond all that, I began to wonder more and more how our spiritual lives affect our material experience. I pulled out of that illness primarily through inner processes. Meditation and visualization, of course, were core, but I also discovered the power of forgiveness and release of others and of myself. And in the process, I discovered a whole new set of understandings about what the mind does and could do, and it's called New Thought. Now, some of you may have encountered New Thought in a Unity Church or a Center for Spiritual Living, or in the old days, a religious science church. But New Thought is not new, and we will spend some time on that in weeks ahead. But as I studied this philosophy and began to apply some of these principles, now, in addition to all the scientific and academic understanding that I had acquired over all those years, I was beginning to have a spiritual and emotional understanding, and it all made sense. So, in spite of all kinds of drives in other directions, I ended up studying for the ministry in the New Thought tradition. It was the only way I could really work with these principles and really apply them, and hopefully begin to make that change in consciousness, in mental framework, that the reports and the briefings I'd been doing all those years were not accomplishing. I was called to be the leader of a couple of small churches, and I helped them grow, both Unitarian and New Thought. Unitarians are universalists as well, and we might explore that as we go forward. And so now I teach classes, and I write books, and I speak on Sundays to Unitarian Universalists here in Florence and in Coos Bay, to centers for spiritual living around the state, and Unity churches also around the state, but particularly in Newport, Oregon. And I speak about how our world has evolved, where it may be going, how our culture has evolved and where it may be going, and how what we think and feel can make a difference in our own lives and in the world. And in this program, Noetic Moments, along with the website, noeticmoments.org, I'm aiming to bring the core of all of that, the science of consciousness, into more people's awareness so that you, the listener, can be empowered to use the amazing power of mind to bring your life and your world into greater harmony. And that's it for today's show. I'll look forward to seeing you next week when we'll start talking about the early building blocks of the field. We'll talk about Sigmund Freud's model of the mind and go on from there. Thank you for listening and joining me here at Noetic Moments on KXCR in Florence, Oregon.
You've been listening to Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments. This program is produced in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in beautiful Florence, Oregon, supported by you, our listeners. Our theme music is Tumbling Planets, composed and performed by Jeff Lovejoy. To hear this program again or learn more about Noetic Sciences, search our website, www.noeticmoments.org.